This is the first project at the intersection of sports and sustainability in our integrative capstone workshop. And with that, I'd like to invite Rowan up to present on this team's work.
Hey everybody, in person and at home. My name is Rowan Carrick, and it is my honor to present our capstone group's findings of stadium's impact, how sports and beer can change the world. So we're going to be focusing on reuse systems, specifically single-use cups, and replacing them with reusable cups for sports stadiums. Jumping into our presentation kickoff, we've divided this up into 3 parts. So first, introduction and context. Next, we're going to talk about our findings over the semester. And lastly, we'll talk about what we want our findings to influence in the future. So an introduction to our client, PR3. PR3 is a nonprofit that's kind of fighting the good fight to get reuse implemented in a whole lot of event areas, such as stadiums that we're going to be focusing on today. PR3 has made the PR3 standards and the reuse playbook that are behind me, which are kind of like the how-to guide of how to make reusable systems in sports stadiums. So they've been doing the work for a really long time, and they think that an area of opportunity is the 2026 FIFA World Cup, which is right around the corner and is based in the US, where we have 11 stadiums participating. They think that this is an area to bridge the gap between the smaller stadiums that are implementing reuse into these larger scale stadiums to really increase that impact overall. So giving some context to the problem we're trying to solve, we've got 350 million fans attending sports stadium games every single year. And that leads to a whole lot of waste. Particularly 5.4 million cups on average can get thrown away by one stadium in a year. The FIFA World Cup, as I mentioned before, is the opportunity that we see to showcase how reuse can be implemented on wider scales. So we have been tasked by PR3 to create a sort of business case on why we think reuse is a potential solution to help combat waste problems. We are going to be talking about the financial impacts of reuse, as well as the hidden social and environmental impacts of reuse. So what is our game time strategy for this? First, we interviewed over 20 people that were organizations that are involved with the reuse. So the stadium operators, reuse providers, concessions, companies, so a whole lot of people in that area. We also reviewed some meta-analyses as well as 11 LCAs and conducted a literature review on some common themes that are currently happening in the research space. We also produced a cost-benefit analysis to kind of look at the financial impact of a stadium implementing reuse and what that cost of transitioning to reuse looks like. And lastly, to calculate those hidden costs of social and environmental impact, we analyzed the lifetime emissions of one single-use plastic cup. So diving into a case study that we want to present to you to really kind of set the stage for what a good reuse system looks like, we're going to be looking at the Moda Center today. That's based in Portland, Oregon, and home to the Portland Trail Blazers. They transitioned to reuse back in 2022 and have been doing it ever since. So they're trailblazers in the reuse game. The first thing they utilize is partnerships, specifically with the company Bold Reuse. Bold Reuse is a reuse provider, which if you don't know, a reuse provider is a company that helps design, track, wash, and take the cups back to stadiums. So they're there from the design of the reuse system all the way throughout implementation. Utilizing the Bold Reuse partnership, they particularly are able to be kind of like a consultant for the Moda Center as they're going through their reuse journey. Another thing they implemented was specifically the cup and the bin design of the reuse system. You'll see on the screen behind me that they use a lot of reuse marketing materials, such as saying, put the cup in this bin and I'm a reusable cup. They don't use marketing materials that are towards the stadium's home team because that can possibly promote theft of the cups and fans taking them home, which is not what we want to happen. You'll also notice that they have these bins are placed wherever you'll see a waste receptacle, and along that, they have sustainability education materials that kind of describe what the reuse system is, gives you a QR code to kind of show you the bigger picture of why they implemented reuse, to really promote that effort with the fans and any stakeholders at the stadium. Now pivoting over to our literature review of the life cycle assessments to look at those hidden impacts. We looked at about 11 LCAs, and these are some themes that we found among them, where reusable cups tend to have less impacts when compared to single use. This is mostly due to the fact that since the cup is reusable, the emissions per use of the cup decrease over time. We also found that there was no particular material that was better or worse for creating a reusable cup when it comes to environmental impacts. But with these 11 LCAs, we did find that there were some inconsistencies, so we conducted a gap analysis to look at some areas of improvement for the future. We found that there was an underreporting of impact categories. So they mostly talked about impact categories that related to emissions or climate change, and not as many mentions about biodiversity, human health, or ecosystem health. So that is an area of potential opportunity in the future. And we also found that stadium-specific LCAs were rather limited as a whole. There weren't a lot that had to do with event spaces as big as stadiums. So we also recommend in the future that an LCA should be performed with context-specific in mind for stadiums, as well as making sure that they are transparent with their methodology and any assumptions that they made throughout the LCA, because that was also something we found to be difficult to interpret while reading the literature review. Lastly, what did we get from these LCA reports? We found the overall break-even point was about 2 to 10 uses, which, in case you don't know the break-even point, it is where the positive environmental impacts equal the negative environmental impacts of operating or manufacturing said object or process. You can kind of think of it as it's the moment in a business where revenue equals costs, that right break-even point. So a reusable cup reaches that break-even point at around 2 to 10 uses, and since the cups can be used dozens of times, it reaches it relatively early in its lifetime. Next, we're going to jump into that financial case of a stadium transitioning to reuse with our cost-benefit analysis. Our results at the end showed us something we didn't really want to see. We found that the financial costs outweigh the financial benefits of reuse. So purchasing the reusable cups, having the contract with the reuse provider is a very costly implementation. I will say that in interviews with stadiums, we were told that they were able to cover these costs through corporate sponsorships as well as government grants that wanted to promote reuse efforts. But our focus for today and our ask from the client isn't about the financial case of reuse. We're looking at the hidden environmental impacts of reuse. So when you factor those in, of the avoided social and environmental impacts of not using single-use plastic cups, we see the benefits start to outweigh the costs. And you might be thinking, how is that the picture? Well, I've got our calculations coming up. Looking at the cost of one single-use plastic cup, it's around 10 cents per cup. What's going into this cost is the raw materials, the manufacturing, and the transportation and shipment of this one cup. When you factor in the hidden environmental costs, you start to include all of these other areas of impact that are not included in that initial 10 cents. So the cost of waste management, ecosystem health, human health, cost of emissions. For our particular project and for our timeline, we wanted to focus specifically on the cost of emissions. Shout out to GHG professors for teaching us how to do that one. So we took the manufacturing, transportation, and end of life and came up with a final number of 1.5 pennies, which is very, very small and increases the cup cost to 11 cents about. However, this is just the cost of one cup. When we think back to our initial figure, that 5.4 million cups are used in one stadium every year, and multiply that by our hidden impact category, we get about $75,600 of emissions costs for one stadium in 1 year. So that number of $75,600 doesn't even include those other impact categories of waste management, ecosystem health, and human health we have listed on the board. That is mostly due to the fact that calculation methodologies for these impact categories isn't standardized across the board as much as emissions are. So we see this as a major area of opportunity for future research and impact. And we can see this number possibly increasing in the future as the scale tips more towards the benefit side. So I just threw a bunch of information at you. What are the overall takeaways? What's like the home run we're trying to hit? Well, first of all, organizations like Peer 3 are already doing this work. They're having conversations about reuse. They're going to the stadiums. They're going to businesses and operations and making sure to put reuse on the forefront. And we have to support them. And our findings, we believe, will do that. Next, reuse has already been successfully implemented in multiple stadiums. We talked about the Moda Center today, which I'm so happy to announce. They just released back in November 2024 that they're transferring over to entirely reusable cups. So not just their alcoholic beverages, but sodas and water, and maybe potentially in the future, all single use. We'll have to see. But we're seeing some really great strides in the reuse area there. Next, really want to emphasize that future research is needed for this space. We really want to think back to that LCA study that we were missing all of those other impact categories, and for our hidden costs, we couldn't calculate them all. To make those goals quantifiable, that can help us set sustainable goals that are actually successful for our environment and our society in the future. And you can only measure and quantify, make that successful by having that number tacked next to it. Lastly, we really want to push the fact that the 2026 FIFA World Cup is the stage that's going to really help the reuse conversation unfold. Since it's implemented mostly in smaller stadiums right now, putting it in these larger capacity stadiums and on that international stage is an amazing place to get the conversation going. As I mentioned, our client PR3 is already going to business conferences and governments and talking with policymakers to make reuse policy easier. And our findings are hopefully going to help that conversation move forward and be a part of the solution of creating a zero-waste society in the future. I want to thank our team, faculty advisor/coach, Chandler Precht, as well as our assistant coaches, Caitlin and Anthony. Game, set, match, and any questions? Yeah. Over there.
Hi, great job, and plenty of information. I'm curious about maybe like the more practical side of how the cups are cleaned and the process that they go through from the time that they're tossed in the bin until they're returned back to the counter for reuse.
Totally, yeah. That is definitely something we wanted to talk about, but given the time constraint, so thank you so much for asking that question. So usually the wash hub facilities from the reuse providers that I was talking about are located within like a 10-mile radius of the centers, maybe like a 20-minute drive in some cases. So stadiums, at the end of the day, at the end of a game, they will do waste management on their side, put all of the reusable cups in different bins and bags. Then the reuse provider will kind of drive up, pick up the cups, and take it to their wash facility, where it has industrial washers, it sanitizes the cups and dries them. They also do quality checks for the cups, so if they have teeth marks or if they're broken, and the reuse provider will actually go and purchase new inventory so that the stadium never runs out of reusable cups, essentially. I believe the turnaround of that can be as soon as one day if needed, but depending, of course, on the scale of the event, that can be longer. So that is kind of the process that the reuse provider plays in that scenario. And we have also seen, an example being CPKC Stadium in Kansas City. They were talking about getting a reuse system, and Bold Reuse reached out and was like, we will open a washing facility right next to the stadium just for you guys, because they are a client that will kind of constantly bring in business as a stadium. So we've seen it happen before, that stadiums have actually influenced more reuse facilities being opened. So thank you.
I know you touched upon the health implications of the materials of the cups, and just with all of this like new information coming out about microplastics and the potential impacts of that having an impact on our health if we're using even like a reusable plastic item. I was just curious like what material you guys decided to go with, and whether that has taken, like you've taken that into consideration and looking into different options.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I will say again, we weren't able to necessarily measure the human health impacts of the cups. So what I'm saying are my own thoughts and based on the research that we did do. There's many different types of cup materials. You might have seen, if you go to Arts and Crafts on Tuesdays, they have aluminum cups for when you go outside, and they also use glass. Those are technically reusable options as well. But we focus on specifically the polypropylene plastic cups, because they're the ones that are mostly utilized by stadiums already, and also manufactured with the reuse providers' manufacturing partners. So it's already kind of a wide-scale process at the moment. I will say it is like a hardier and sturdier plastic compared to the usual single-use ones that the stadium uses. But when we were looking at the health effects, we were kind of looking at the manufacturing, raw material collection, and transport effects on human health rather than immediately the plastic itself. That was a little bit, it wasn't something we could necessarily calculate right now at this moment. Those processes are still kind of in development. But thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was really great. I had a question about why you were not considering single-use biodegradable plastic cups, which ideally would solve the cost issue as well, because the difference between the cost is not as high as it would be to produce a thicker material polypropylene cup. Mm-hmm. And also cleanup costs will reduce, the amount of water you use, the emissions from the cleanup will reduce. So why was that not considered?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think almost a follow-up question for that is like, how guaranteed are they to be biodegradable, and what are those effects on the environment? Something, at least in my personal life, is I remember a university I attended handed out silverware that they marketed as biodegradable, but it turns out they couldn't biodegrade naturally. It had to be an industrial composting machine, and like a whole lot of other processes kind of go into that. For our particular scope, we only wanted to focus on the polypropylene cups to kind of keep that level across the board. There's, of course, definitely technology potential for those biodegradable plastics. I'd love it if I could eat a cup, and then it just doesn't even have to go into like a waste facility. So
I think I mainly asked because we're all using it today at Columbia.
Yep.
So
So,
how
yeah.
biodegradable are they if we're using it here? So I hope there's
Good question. Maybe a future capstone. Cool. Thank you.